I never thought I'd have to share this experience, but what happened on January 7th, 2024, changed everything. I'm Matthew Carter. I live in Washington State, an ordinary guy, husband, father, and worker. I never thought that day would be my last, but it was. For 11 minutes and 46 seconds, I was clinically dead, and in that time, I felt more alive than ever. The experience I had beyond this world has deeply affected me. Jesus showed me future events, especially those planned for March 2025, and I can't keep these visions to myself. You have to listen. It was a cold winter evening in Washington after a long day at work. My job was ordinary, the typical 9 to 5, but that day I was more tired than usual. It had started raining in the afternoon, and by the time I got in my car, the roads were slick. I called my wife, Rachel, and she reminded me to pick up some milk on my way home. I promised her I'd stop at the corner store near our house. It seemed like any other day. I had no idea it would be the last conversation I'd have with her before she passed away. Driving along Interstate 5, I kept the radio on, flipping through stations. The rain was coming down harder, and the windshield wipers could barely keep up. I wasn't speeding, I was going 50 miles an hour. But visibility got worse quickly. Then, without warning, a sudden flash of headlights blinded me. A truck, completely out of control, was swerving straight towards me. I didn't have time to react or even think. My body tensed up, and then everything went black. The next moment, I found myself floating, detached from my physical form. At first, there was no pain, no cold, just a deep emptiness. I had lost all awareness of my body, simply existing in a state of suspension, my mind unusually clear. Yet something was off. I no longer felt the weight of my body. Looking down, I saw the scene of the accident unfold. My Honda Civic lay wrecked, steam rising from the crushed hood, while the truck driver had climbed out, pacing back and forth in shock. Soon, paramedics arrived and pulled my lifeless body from the wreckage. It was unsettling to watch them try to revive me, their frantic efforts to restart my heart. I should have been terrified, but I wasn't. Instead, I felt a profound peace unlike anything I'd ever known. The sound of the sirens and the shouts of the first responders seemed distant, like I was watching a silent film. Then, I felt something behind me. A force was pulling me. I turned around and there it was, a tunnel. Not a dark, endless void, but a passage of golden light, vibrant and moving, as if it had a mind of its own. The instant I saw it, I knew it wasn't a natural phenomenon. I understood it was a passage to something beyond human comprehension, beckoning me closer. As I drew nearer, everything around me began to fade away. The sounds of the paramedics, the twisted metal, the rain, even the city of Washington, dissolved into nothingness. At that moment, the tunnel was all that existed. It wasn't just light. It was alive. It pulsed, radiated warmth, and enveloped me like a loving hug. I felt an irresistible pull drawing me in. Then I noticed a figure standing at the far end. At first, his face was hidden by the dazzling glow, but deep down, I recognized him. My soul identified him before my mind could comprehend. Jesus. The realization sent shivers throughout my being, and those shivers weren't from fear, but from overwhelming awe and love. He was more than just a figure. He embodied everything. He was love, truth, and power all at once. His voice resonated not as a sound in my ears, but as an inner whisper speaking directly to my soul. "Matthew," he said, calling my name as if he'd known me forever, as if he had been waiting for me. Jesus extended his hand. The moment his touch reached me, my entire reality shifted. The tunnel vanished, and I suddenly found myself standing on a city street that resembled Washington. But it wasn't Washington at all. It felt familiar, yet there was an unmistakable difference. The buildings were sleek and modern, yet something was off. People strolled by, going about their business, but their expressions were strangely blank. They moved mechanically, absorbed in their own worlds and disconnected from one another. "Look closely," Jesus urged me, his tone gentle yet firm. I scanned my surroundings. I saw a woman enter a coffee shop. Instead of using cash or a card, she swiped her hand over a scanner. A faint light flickered beneath her skin. A technology that seemed harmless, convenient, even normal. But then Jesus spoke words that sent chills down my spine. "This is just the beginning of a deception you cannot yet grasp." At first, it just seemed like advanced technology. But then the scene shifted. People began willingly accepting this new system. It started with payments, then identification, and eventually it touched every aspect of life. Jesus turned to me, his eyes filled with sorrow. "This is how it all begins," he said. As I watched, a deep unease settled over me. I wanted to shout a warning, but no one could hear me. Then Jesus revealed an even darker vision. March 2025. What I saw next made my blood run cold. Standing beside Jesus, the scene transformed. The city vanished. In its place, I found myself in a massive conference hall filled with screens displaying world leaders, scientists, and public figures making an announcement. One screen displayed the date, March 2025. A man stepped forward. I didn't recognize his face, but his presence and confidence inspired trust. With a smile, he declared, "We have discovered the ultimate solution for security, health, and prosperity. This is the future." Behind him, the screens displayed images of a new system, a small implanted device, like a tiny glowing mark just beneath the skin. At first, it just seemed like a promise of convenience, safety, and financial security. But I felt like something was deeply wrong. Jesus touched my shoulder and said, "This is the time of deception. They will never understand what it truly is." The announcement was met with thunderous applause, and the world embraced it excitedly. But then Jesus showed me more. Suddenly, I saw people lining up to receive this mark. There was no force, no threats, just pure desperation. Without it, they couldn't buy food, even access their bank accounts, or even get medical care. I saw a man struggling to resist, clinging to his faith as his wife and children starved, and his employer refused to let him work without the mark. I witnessed the precise moment he gave in, and as he accepted it, I felt a darkness seep into his soul. There were no dramatic outbursts or possessions, yet something had irrevocably changed. Jesus then met my gaze, his expression filled with sorrow. "They won't even realize what they've lost," he murmured. Then I saw how it all began, how the deception wasn't a sudden twist, but unfolded gradually. It developed step by step, so slowly that no one noticed at first. It started with small conveniences, implanted devices for easy payments. These smart systems, designed to simplify life, soon became essential for work, travel, and healthcare. Even churches adopted them. I heard pastors telling their congregations, "This isn't the mark of the beast, it's just technology. God understands." And people believed them. Jesus shook his head. "Even my own people will be deceived." I saw how social pressure was applied. Those who resisted were mocked and labeled as conspiracy theorists, extremists, or relics of the past. Some churches stayed true, warning their congregations, but many gave in. They didn't see the danger because it wasn't forced on them. It was welcomed. Jesus looked at me with deep sorrow. The greatest deception is the one that doesn't look like a deception at all. Then I witnessed something even more terrifying. A monumental crisis occurred, a series of massive natural disasters, economic collapses, and violent conflicts that gripped the world in fear. From the chaos, a leader emerged promising peace, stability, and unity. He wasn't a dictator or tyrant. Charismatic, articulate, and logical, he offered answers that people found irresistible. Under his guidance, a new global system was introduced, a system advertised as the way to prevent war, famine, and financial instability. I saw how readily people embraced it. They hailed him as a genius and a peacemaker, and nations submitted without resistance. Yet Jesus spoke urgently. This is how the control begins. It wouldn't come through brute force, but through solutions that initially seemed harmless. Then the rules changed. Those who resisted the system began to disappear. Some were arrested for spreading misinformation, while others lost their homes because their bank accounts were frozen overnight. Churches that challenged the system were shut down, and dissenters were labeled as threats to progress. The world was tricked into a false sense of peace, and Jesus whispered to me, "This is the trap." Then he showed me something even deeper. I started to see what was happening in the spiritual realm behind all of this. I saw waves of darkness engulfing cities, unnoticed by the people living there, people walking around like nothing was wrong. Yet, on a spiritual level, they were changing. The technology wasn't just physical, it was getting into their minds and souls. I saw prayers weakening, pastors losing their passion, and church services becoming empty shows rather than true meetings with God. And the worst part? They didn't even realize what was happening. Jesus pointed to a family in their home, already equipped with the new system. To the outside world, their lives looked perfect. No sickness, no money problems. But I could see what they couldn't. Their spirits were clouded, their hearts hardened. They still talked about God, still went to church, yet their connection was gone. Jesus then said, "The enemy doesn't need to completely rip away their faith, just slowly weaken it until my voice can no longer be heard." I realized the enemy's plan was never to force people into outright evil. It was to make them so comfortable, so numb, that they no longer needed God. That's when I understood the truth. This wasn't just a fight for control. It was a battle for souls. The next vision Jesus showed me was even more personal and heartbreaking. I saw families, husbands, wives, and children torn apart, not by war or disease, but by an insidious force of deception and division. It started small. I saw a father at the dinner table, engrossed in scrolling through the digital interface on his wristwatch, while his children excitedly tried to share something with him, but he barely noticed. His mind was completely absorbed, perpetually distracted, while his wife sat across from him, visibly worried, seeming to plead, "Don't you see what's happening? We're losing each other." But he just laughed it off, saying, "Come on, it's just technology, it makes life easier." "Why are you always so paranoid?" she shot back. Then Jesus told me, "This will be the enemy's most powerful weapon, convincing people that their chains are actually freedom." At that moment, I saw a mother desperately pleading with her teenage son. He'd just gotten his first digital upgrade, and she could already sense something was wrong. His responses were shallow, distant, almost robotic, no longer those of the boy who once prayed with her before bed. "Please, don't go through with this. You don't need it," she begged. But he just sighed and rolled his eyes. "Mom, this is the future. Everyone's doing it. You're the one stuck in the past," he replied. She tried to hug him, but he pulled away. The vision shifted, and I saw churches begin to divide. Half the congregation embraced the new system as progress, while the other half resisted, warning that it would lead to spiritual blindness. Those who resisted were mocked, ostracized, and even labeled as troublemakers. I saw people report their own family members for refusing to conform. I saw a woman sobbing as her husband declared, "I can't stay with you if you don't get this." Her eyes filled with pain as she whispered, "I'd rather lose you than lose my soul." Jesus then spoke with a heavy heart. Many will face this choice, and many will choose wrong. Then Jesus revealed something shocking. The mark wasn't what people thought. There was no obvious violence, no physical force. At first, it was just a tool, a way to replace passwords, improve security and monitor health. But over time, it became much more. I saw a man trying to buy food. He reached for his wallet, but the cashier shook her head. "He needs to upgrade," she said. Looking around, he noticed everyone else simply waving their hands over a scanner, their digital marks faintly glowing. They smiled and chatted, completely unaware of what they had given up. But when he refused, the air grew cold. People stared as if he were an outsider, an intruder in their perfect world. I saw others lose their homes, their jobs, practically their very ability to function in society, not because they had done anything wrong, but because they chose not to conform. Jesus looked at me with deep sorrow. This is how the enemy works, not by force, but by exclusion. Then I saw something even more disturbing. The mark wasn't just physical, it had a spiritual dimension. I saw people with the mark trying to pray. They still went to church, still called out to God, yet their prayers seemed empty, their worship hollow, as if a veil prevented them from truly reaching Him. Jesus whispered, "They won't even know what they've lost." The vision then shifted to a small group of individuals who were unmistakably different. They bore no mark and were not part of the system. They were hidden, meeting in secret to pray. Though few in number, their faith burned like an unquenchable flame. I saw a young girl, no older than 10, praying with a power I had never witnessed before. She had no access to the digital world, yet she possessed something infinitely stronger, the Holy Spirit. Jesus pointed to them and said, "These are my true followers." They had no earthly security, no homes, no jobs. Some even lived in the desert, moving from place to place, and yet they possessed a peace that defied their circumstances. Then miracles began to unfold before my eyes. I saw a man raise his hands in prayer and food materialized before him. A woman with a sick child who couldn't reach a doctor touched him and watched as he was instantly healed. Though cut off from the world, they were connected to something far greater. Jesus turned to me and said, "The world may call them weak, but in my kingdom they are the strongest." Then he showed me something even more astonishing. The world had turned against these faithful. Laws were enacted, targeting them. They could no longer buy, sell, or even move freely. Yet, inexplicably, they remained unharmed. I saw a group of believers surrounded by armed men. These soldiers had found them, reported them, tracked them down, but when they raised their weapons, the guns jammed. The soldiers exchanged confused glances before turning and fleeing as angels stood guard among the believers. Then, I saw a man walking through the city, completely invisible to the scanning cameras searching for unmarked individuals. The system simply couldn't detect him. Jesus proclaimed, "I will protect mine in ways the world cannot understand." Soon after, I witnessed the multiplication of food. Even when supplies were scarce, they never ran out. The people were continually sustained. I saw a storm approaching, a disaster that ravaged a city, but in the areas where the faithful resided, the storm abruptly stopped, as if an invisible shield had been erected around them. Then Jesus spoke words that shook me to my core. "The enemy will come with power, but my power is greater. Tell them not to be afraid." His expression was solemn and urgent as he continued, "Tell them to prepare now, before the choice is taken from them." I saw people scrambling in those final moments, desperately trying to resist, but it was too late. They had ignored the warnings, convinced they had plenty of time. But when the defining moment arrived, they weren't ready. Panic overwhelmed them, and they gave in. I saw believers, once strong in their faith, compromise little by little, until they could no longer distinguish truth from lies. The deception crept in so slowly, they barely noticed the shift. Then Jesus revealed another group to me, those who had prepared long before the world began to change. These folks weren't just physically ready, they were spiritually grounded. They had built a faith so strong, so unshakable, that when the time came, they stood firm. Jesus said, "Tell them to deepen their relationship with me now. They need to know my voice so well that nothing can lead them astray." I saw them in their Bibles every day, not out of habit, but like it was their lifeline. They didn't just go to church. They lived a life of prayer, always seeking God's guidance. They taught their kids to love Jesus more than anything in the world. I saw families making tough choices ahead of time, giving up certain comforts and stepping away from the system while they still could. Others formed tight-knit communities, supporting each other because they knew they'd need each other when the world turned hostile. Then Jesus said something that sent chills down my spine. He said, "Many will wait until it's too late. They will cry out for help, but by then they will have chosen another master." I felt an urgency like never before, knowing our time to prepare was almost up. When Jesus looked at me, I saw for the first time a deep sorrow in his eyes, not born of weakness, but from knowing so many would refuse to listen. "I have given them everything," he said. "I have warned them through my word, through my prophets, and through my spirit. Yet, so many still refuse to see." Then he placed a hand on my shoulder and spoke words I'll never forget. "The days ahead will be the hardest mankind has ever faced. But my people need not fear. I will guide them and protect them. They must choose now whom they will serve." I saw his deep love, a love for every soul, even those who would turn away. There was no anger in his tone, only grief for the lost. Then he added one last message. "Tell them not to be afraid. The enemy may rule this world, but he does not control eternity. Those who remain faithful to me will reign with me in the kingdom to come." And just like that, he was gone. A moment later, I found myself gasping for air. The hospital room spun around me as the incessant beeping of the monitors filled my ears. I was back. A nurse rushed to my side, shaking her head. "You were gone for almost 12 minutes, she said. "It's a miracle you're back." But I wasn't thinking about the miracle. My mind was consumed with what I had seen. I stared at my hands, my body, my surroundings. Everything felt surreal. I had been with Jesus, and now I was back in this fragile, broken world. For days, I wrestled with how to share my experience. Who would believe me? I confided in a close friend, but he brushed it off with a laugh, claiming it was nothing more than hallucinations from oxygen deprivation. Even my wife was hesitant. She recognized the conviction in my voice, but she didn't know how to react. That's when I remembered Jesus' words. "Don't worry about who listens. Your job is to share." So here I am, sharing this with you, not for attention or validation, but because Jesus instructed me to. March 2025 is coming, and the world is changing exactly as he showed me. If you are reading this, don't wait until it's too late. Prepare your heart, strengthen your faith, and teach your children. Stay close to Jesus, because the deception is coming, and most people won't even notice it. What struck me most was the quietness, the subtlety of how it would all happen. The enemy wouldn't force his way in or announce his arrival with terror and destruction. He would creep into hearts through comfort, convenience, and gradual compromise. I saw people accepting these changes without question. At first, it was small innovations, new technologies, improvements to daily life, artificial intelligence promising better decisions, all presented as ways to improve life, reduce stress, and ease hardship. I even saw churches embracing these advancements, with pastors using them to track attendance, organize worship, and enhance Bible study with personalized spiritual guidance. But amidst the change, no one noticed the subtle grip on emotions that was beginning. I saw a young man in his 20s, once passionately devoted to Christ, whose zeal faded after receiving an upgrade. His prayers became infrequent, His hunger for God's word diminished, not because he lost his faith, but because the urgency was gone. I also saw a woman overwhelmed by anxiety, whose emotions were controlled by the new system, keeping her in a constant state of neutrality. However, this also numbed her conscience. She no longer felt the weight of sin and had stopped repenting. Jesus turned to me and said, "This is the enemy's method, not to take away faith, but to make them so comfortable that they no longer need me." I cried, seeing people lose their spiritual discernment without even realizing it. They still went to church, they still prayed, but their connection with God eroded day after day until one day they simply stopped caring. Then, when the final step arrived, the request for total loyalty to the system, they offered no resistance. At that moment, Jesus showed me a momentous event that sent shivers down my spine. I saw chaos spreading, nations trembling, people screaming in despair, and an air so heavy with fear that it was almost tangible. Something monumental had happened, a shock that shook the very foundations of society. Governments rushed to respond. Leaders held emergency meetings with faces etched with urgency. World economies collapsed overnight, and bank accounts were suddenly frozen. Businesses shut down, and one message echoed across every screen. "A solution is coming," Jesus whispered. "This will be the final push." In their desperation, people turned to the new system without objection. They were too scared. Respected and trusted religious leaders appeared on television speaking calmly. "This is not the mark of the beast. It is simply a way to rebuild after the crisis. God wants us to be wise and participate." As a result, churches divided. Some blindly followed, trusting the voices they had always listened to, while others, who had recognized the truth, were labeled extremists or subversives. I saw a faithful man beg his family, "Please don't do this, this is what Jesus warned us about." But his brother laughed, dismissing him as paranoid. "If you don't want to eat, that's your business," he said. And despite the man's desperate pleas, his family had already made their decision. The deception was complete. Jesus spoke again, "Only those who are deeply rooted in me will see the truth. All others will be led astray by lies." Then the vision shifted, and I saw a beacon of light in the darkness. All over the world, small groups stood firm. They had refused to join the system, and in doing so, they had lost everything. Homes, jobs, even family ties, but they had never lost their faith. They met in secret, in houses, in forests, in abandoned spaces, without modern technology or access to the new system, yet they possessed something far more powerful. I saw them pray with an intensity I had never witnessed before. Their worship was pure, raw, and alive. Miracles happened among them. Food appeared where there was none. The sick were instantly healed, and they became invisible to tracking systems. When they passed through security scanners, nothing detected them. I saw a woman with her children who hadn't eaten in days. She prayed over an empty bowl, and in moments it overflowed with bread. Jesus said, "Just as I provided for my people in the desert, I will provide for you again." I saw angels walking among them, seemingly ordinary figures, until they stopped soldiers. Soldiers, sent to arrest the believers, were compelled to turn back as if they had forgotten their mission. God was protecting his people in ways beyond human understanding. Then Jesus declared, "This is why you must not fear. The world may reject you, but I will never forsake you." I saw the believers grow stronger, even as the world around them crumbled. And then, he said one last thing. "I am coming soon, and those who persevere will reign with me." Then everything faded to black. The world around me went dark, like a veil had been lifted, showing what was hiding underneath. Demons roaming free, influencing everything from the media to world leaders, even sneaking into churches. No one could see them, because they had already traded their faith for comfort and their wisdom for convenience. Then I heard the blare of a trumpet, the final one. I saw two groups of people. The first were those who had prepared, who had resisted the system, and who had stayed true to Jesus. As the world crumbled, they stood tall, unmoved, unafraid, because they had already given everything to Christ. The second group were those who had waited too long, assuming they had another chance, only to realize it was too late. They cried out and begged for mercy, but the time for decision was over. Jesus looked at me, his voice serious. There will come a time when the choice is final, when those who are mine will be sealed under my protection, and those who have chosen the world will no longer hear my voice.